Welcome back to the Property Strategy Podcast. You're here with Joey DeGata. Now, I am sitting down with the man, the legend, Mr. Lloyd Edge. Lloyd, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast, mate. I must admit, I read your book many, many years ago. I'm really honored to be sitting down on the podcast with you. Welcome.
You're way too kind, Joey, but it's really nice to be here, and I'm really looking forward to having a chat.
Mate, do you mind I'm sure every one of our listeners has seen your name around, maybe even read the book, but do you mind just giving us a little bit of a spiel in terms of who you are, a little bit about the business, and maybe a bit of a shout out for your own book there as well, multiple books?
Absolutely. So for me, I've been investing in property for almost 25 years. So it's almost 25 years since I bought my first property. So I was into property for a long time before I started the business.
Yep.
I wasn't originally a real estate agent. I was actually a teacher.
Okay.
That's my background.
High school?
I taught music across basically from year 3 to year 12.
Okay, cool.
So, but it was instrumental. So it wasn't classroom. It was basically teaching instrumental, conducting bands, had great opportunities, took students on overseas tours.
Awesome.
Yeah, all the fun stuff.
Yeah, wow.
During that time, I started to build my portfolio, essentially. I guess the very first property I bought was something that I don't recommend people do, which is basically buy a home to live in.
Yep.
But that's what I was doing at the time.
Okay.
But after a couple of years, I started to catch the bug and think that I should be able to do something else further than that, particularly when I was looking at the income that I was earning and how I'd be able to set myself up for the future.
Nice.
So I started to grow my portfolio from there and developed it through my years as a teacher. So I actually retired from teaching because I developed a passive income that equaled what I was earning as a teacher.
Amazing, right?
So I was actually able to retire at a younger age.
Yep.
And then I basically, when I started the business, which has been going for about 11 or 12 years now, I probably had 10 or 12 properties at the time. But for me, it was about combining education with property, which are my two passions.
And that's really, really beautiful, right? And so was that the segue into like becoming an author as well?
Yeah, well, in terms of that, I mean, I guess going back a bit, a couple of years before I started the business, I actually started a blog, and the blog was Aus Property Power Hour.
Yep.
And the reason I started that was a bit of a joke that my wife Renee suggested I should write a blog and put it out there, so I stopped talking about property at home.
With her, because she was bored of it.
Which is pretty funny because all she does now is talk about her handbags. So and her marathons and all that sort of stuff. But that's basically what I did initially. And then it led on to, I guess initially when I started the business, I actually started the business before I had the website because I was been on a few, because of my success in my portfolio, I was on a few podcasts. I think I was on 2GB radio here and maybe in some of the print media. And I had a few people contacting me, asking me how I could help them with property.
Yep.
But at the time I wasn't qualified. So, but that one thing led to another. So I got my real estate licenses and all that kind of stuff and then started the business officially and went from there. In terms of writing my books, that happened years down the track. Now, I didn't write the books as a sort of a marketing tool, I guess, like a lot of people do. Obviously, it's proved to be, really successful and I'm quite humbled by that. But for me, it was about, I realized that I've actually got a story to tell. Yeah. And that's what I wanted to
coming back to that education piece as well, right? That's
right. So for me, it wasn't about just putting out a book and saying, yep, I can buy properties, help me buy good property, and this is my strategy. It went back from the start. I grew up on the land. My parents didn't have much money. I went to school and then I went and studied music at university. But I didn't feel I was ever going to have much money. And I had dreams of creating a better lifestyle for my future family. At the time I was single. So that was my premises around wanting to get into investing. So when I wrote the books, it was around, my first book, Positively Geared, it was really around, why I wanted to get out of teaching, why I wanted to build property. And then the strategies that I used, but it segued into that. And I discussed the various strategies. But for me, it was just getting that message out there that, that if I can do it, so can you. Because I had about $30,000 saved up when I started. And I was also in my mid to late 20s at the time. So I didn't get in there. I wasn't like an 18-year-old.
Yeah, straight out of school.
I had no interest in property as soon as I left school. But for me, it was about just getting that message out there and saying that it is something that you can achieve. If you have the right goals in place, achieving something like just replacing your income, if you want to, the average sort of income is quite doable. So that was the premise behind, writing the books. It was pretty funny because when I was writing it, I thought, who's going to write a book that I'm writing? Like,
who would want that, right?
Like I'd never imagined myself as an author. And then, it did really well, and it became it's currently the best-selling book in the property
space, right?
Property space, and the second highest of all time in Australia. So, but I very humbled for that because I didn't imagine that was actually.
Mate, you're there front and center, still in the airport terminals. Yeah, you're still there in every good bookstore.
And it's funny that because sometimes I'll be in the line ready to catch a plane, and there'll be someone else in the line
holding my book.
And it's a bit embarrassing in a way. And at first I was thinking like, should I go and say,
do you want me to sign that?
Well, people ask me to sign the book, and I'm a bit taken back by that because I'm not some famous guy. So it's pretty funny, but it's quite humbling. But yeah, they're front and center there, and I often get. But what I really appreciate is the messages I get from people about how it's sort of inspired them.
That's it,
and that's the main thing. Like I get a lot of people coming to me who want to work with us as their buyer's agent.
Yep.
But there's a lot of other people who just read the books and say thank you. I feel inspired, and I'd really like to sort of change something for my kids and things like that. So it's that message where people kind of feel motivated to do something, which I really appreciate.
So if we go back to a comment that you threw out there as well, and I always like to ask the guests this about the first asset or the first property that we ever bought. And interesting to note, you say that it's one that you wouldn't necessarily recommend. It was a principal place of residence. Do you mind just throwing a little bit of information around that property? So what was it? Rough numbers in terms of purchase price. What would it be worth today? Is it still in the portfolio? Is
Absolutely.
it not?
It's all out there. I wrote about it in my book.
Yeah.
So the first property I bought was a 1-bedroom apartment.
Yep.
And it was in Rockdale.
Yep.
So actually not too far from here.
Yep.
And I lived in that for probably 3 or 4 years. Purchase price on that was about $258,000.
Yep.
And it was new, but not off the plan. So it was an established property.
Yep.
But it was new. The developer was trying to get rid of some stock. So I was lucky that I probably bought it for $30,000 or $40,000 less than other properties in the area. The property performed pretty well over the years. It did sort of triple in value over time.
Beautiful.
And I was kind of lucky in a way. I had no idea what I was doing. I was looking for a home to live in. And it just happened to be near, not too far from, it was in Bay Street in Rockdale, so it was not too far from the water at Brighton and the Sands, and not too far from, there's a train station, and all the fundamentals that you look for. It kind of had that, but I didn't know what I was doing. But these days, like I wouldn't recommend...
Go out there and buy that as your purchase, right?
Well, I wouldn't recommend firstly necessarily buying principal place of residence first.
Yep.
But I also don't recommend buying units. So there's a couple of things in there that I wouldn't recommend for people. Do I still have it? I held that property I actually only sold it I think last year, or the year before last. And I actually probably did do quite well. I actually refinanced equity out of it 4 times.
Beautiful.
So it actually helped me build my portfolio.
Well, then it comes back to it because people often say that apartments don't grow in value, but your apartment is...
It grew in value. When you do and we look at data and research all the time, and when you look at comparison between how much houses grow compared to units, yes, houses outweigh that.
Yep.
But because I was on a budget at the time, I had a $300,000 borrowing capacity and $30,000 in the bank or something.
Yep.
So... it grew in value, but that's what I could afford at the time.
Correct, yeah.
So from that
served the purpose, right?
It served the purpose. Now, if I had some advice and someone said go and rent vest was not a term back then. But if I did go and rent vest, I might have, back in those days, I could have bought a house on big acreage out in the country somewhere. Even these days, you can't do that.
No. Yeah. So if we come back to just another comment that you mentioned there with I wouldn't necessarily be going buy my principal place of residence first. I'm a huge believer in that as well. I definitely resonate with what you're saying, but do you mind just kind of elaborating on why? Like, why would that be the case that you would delay that PPR purchase?
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons around that, but I feel that if you go and buy your PPR first, it can limit your borrowing capacity moving forward because you're basically putting all your eggs in one basket there. Now, for some people, and let's just throw around and figure out there, if someone has, $1.2 million borrowing capacity and they, if they're going to do an investment, you know yourself with stuff you do with your strategies that you could do a strategy where they could buy 2 $600,000 properties and they could yield at 5% and they could set yourself up to do another one and so on. But if you're buying your PPR, you're not likely to go and spend $600,000. You're likely to go and spend your 1.2,
if not more,
and try to get the best house you can do.
Yep.
So that to me can really set you back. And of course, PPR being non-tax deductible debt and everything. I'm a big advocate of having a goal and working towards that goal. So having PPR is always a goal that I talk to like with my clients.
Yep.
But that it should be something sort of down the track. Because often people will come and they might want to buy a PPR, but their budget at the moment extends to maybe just buying a unit. Like especially if they're living in the Sydney or the Melbourne markets. Yeah. So, do you want to just buy a 2-bedroom unit just so you can live in it? Or do you want to set up a strategy where the goal in 5 or 7 years' time might be to buy a PPR, and that might be
The right size.
Yeah, the right size. You know, it might be a townhouse, it might be a house with some land. But let's get some figures happening for your investment portfolio. Let's look at like if people have goals in terms of passive income. Let's start working towards that, because often people come and say, I want to, earn passive income in the future from properties. And let's just say they want to replace their income, or they want to have 100K in passive income, but then they want to go buy a PPR. Buying PPR is not going to help you get passive income in your portfolio.
Yeah, it will take you further away from that goal, right?
It's all about that strategy.
Have you noticed, obviously you said you've been around for over a decade in terms of the business. Have you noticed from a client mindset, especially over the last kind of few years, a shift away from that even being a goal, that aspiration towards having the PPR? Have you noticed that people are going, I don't really care about it anymore?
It is, definitely. And rent investing is something that's talked about a lot now. When I first came onto the scene, it wasn't really a thing at all. And I remember going on a couple of podcasts, and I actually can't remember who they were with, but I was actually talking about sort of rent investing, and people hadn't really heard of it. And then over the years, it's become a thing. But yeah, these days, people actually come to me and they say, I'm happy to keep renting where I am and buy buy some investments and stuff like that. So, and some people also come and say, we're not interested in buying a PPR. We just want to help out our kids for the future.
Yeah.
Obviously, it depends what stages of life you're in. Like if you're in your 20s, that's different to if you're in your 40s or your 50s. And of course, some people might already have a PPR and they come to us, but they want to get rid of the debt on that. So that's when we sort of have that conversation and set up a strategy about that, and then involve their financial advisor, and then we look at goals of how investments can you can use investments to pay off your PPR debt, which is what I've done with our PPR as well.
And so if we come back to, even if it's that kind of amateur investor, if you were to say kind of Lloyd's philosophy in a nutshell in terms of your overarching beliefs with respect to investing, because some people are like hugely in you must buy with as much capital growth as possible and forget about cash flow. And then you got people going, just make sure you only chase cash flow, and don't worry about the capital growth because you need every single dollar from the rent coming through. Is there a nice balance or a sweet spot, or is there a particular belief that you have with respect to building a portfolio out in the sense of the types of assets that you want to go and chase?
So that needs to be quite customized for everybody. I don't have a particular belief one way or the other, because it really depends on people's, it depends a lot on their finances, their borrowing capacity, and to some extent their goals. So if someone comes and they've got $800,000 borrowing capacity, then we really do need to look at cash flow to help them going. But you can't just chase only cash flow, because sometimes people come and they say they want to have 7% yield or 8% yield, but that's not really possible in good markets. Unless you're trying to chase a dual income property or something, you're going to end up with a house in a mining town, which is very volatile, which is something that I always warn my clients against. And I've got an example in my book where I did that once, and it didn't work out. So can you
we'll just put a pause on the philosophy there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I had about 3 or 4 properties, and then I wanted to. Now this is interesting because I actually hired a buyer's agent.
Right.
For this purchase.
Okay.
But I said to the buyer's agent, I want to achieve financial freedom through property. And I want to buy positive cash flow properties. So he essentially found me what I asked him to find me, but he didn't tell me anything. He didn't really educate me at anything. So he found me a property and it was in central Queensland mining town off Blackwater. Now I paid about $440,000 for it, and it was renting for about $800 a week. So, and at that time, and this is back in the 2008, 2009 or something, there was still a lot of growth happening in mining. I held that property. I've still got the property, by the way, but I held that property up until like 2012, 2013 when the mining boom collapsed. But year on year, the market was getting about 25-30% growth. It was just massive.
Wow.
And there were people back in those days that, like, if you look at some of those areas in like Western Australia, Port Hedland and the like, Karratha, there were people that had like 10 of those properties because they were really greedy, and there's all this, they're getting massive cash flow, massive growth.
And growth,
and a lot of people wwent bankrupt. Unfortunately, I only had one of these properties. But what that particular buyer's agent should have explained to me was that you need to buy where there's good fundamentals. You need to buy where there's 3 or 4 industries that are propping up the economy.
Not necessarily just the one.
Not just the one. And also a bigger population than what Blackwater had. Because when because it was rented by a mining company, and the problem with that is that when the company moves out of town, the individuals or the families that live there they're not going to pay the sort of rent. So it actually went, when that lease ended there, it went from paying $800 a week to about $190 a week.
Wow.
Overnight. So So it went from a positive cash flow property
to a very negatively
to
good one.
A very negative one, which is great for tax reasons.
Tax reasons, yeah. What happened to the value at that time?
So the value, I think the value went back to about 60 or 80,000.
80,000.
Yeah, because when I was I never actually got a valuation. I was too scared to do something like that.
Course.
But when I was looking online, I was thinking like, my goodness, what's going on with this? Because it went back, may not have been quite that low, but it went back a lot. And it's only now just started to pick up. So I'm renting the property now. I've still got it, and it's probably renting for $350, $400 a week.
Yeah.
So it's.
And what do you think it's worth? Around what you paid for it?
I think it's not quite worth what I paid for it.
Okay. Yeah. Why do you still hold in the portfolio? Is it like a lesson to yourself?
It's a lesson to myself, but it's a lesson. It's a lesson so that I can remember what not to do.
Yeah.
And it's a lesson to
your clients,
to my clients. I can say I've still got this property.
Yeah. But I suppose from your end, it was about buffers and whatnot that you would have had in place at the time.
It was. So for most people, if something like that happens, I'd be recommending, well, you need to get rid of that property if you can afford to, and it's not going to. But if you sell a property and you're going to end up $100,000 in negative, and then you still got to pay the loan off after you sell it, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
For me, fortunately, I had a good portfolio, and I continued to build a portfolio after that.
Yep.
So I managed to swallow up that negative gearing, and it doesn't really affect me. But for other people, that would have affected them. Yeah. But for me, I'll sell it one day, but it's there. Okay. But yeah, so
have the other assets in the portfolio all had that mindset of positive cash flow?
No.
Okay.
No. So that's I learned a bit from that.
Yep.
Because I realized after that and over the years, and obviously this is how I work with my clients now, is that developing a positively cash flow property portfolio, it really comes down to the capital growth you get on your portfolio, because you can never create true wealth if you don't get capital growth. Because if you just buy positive cash flow and then you're highly leveraged, and when I started investing, I was borrowing about 95% on everything.
Yep. When you could.
Back in those days, you could. But if you've got properties that don't increase in value, or they go backwards, then you're going to be in a bit of strife there, because there's no point buying a property that 10 years after you buy it, it's not worth any more than you bought it for. So for me, buying properties that do have strong capital growth, even in regional markets, they still got to have strong growth. Maybe not as strong as you might get in capital cities, but they're still got to be there. And then my philosophy is having that exit strategy, so that there'll be some properties in the future that you'd sell down to be able to then pay off other debt, because you want to keep, but to be able to pay down, like sell properties at a profit, they need to have actually increased in value.
Yes.
So you need to have those right assets. And then once you've paid off other debt, that's how you get true positive cash flow on properties, because you need to have that no debt. There's like, people think that you can buy a property at, using 90% LVO or 100% if they're going to borrow equity as well. And then they want to be positive cash flow. But that doesn't really happen. And if it does, you're only going to be slightly positive cash flow by a couple of bucks a week. Yeah. That's not true positive cash flow. Yeah. You're not going to develop, true wealth that way. And I don't actually know of anyone who's actually developed financial freedom from buying positive cash flow properties only. So for me, it needs to be a balance. I've currently got 18 properties in my portfolio. Yep. There's a mixture of some in capital cities, some in regional markets, some dual income properties. The ones in the regional markets, they've got good cash flow, because you do need cash flow
to hold this thing, right?
You need cash flow basically to stay in the game. Yeah. So cash flow is important, and I do balance my portfolio with cash flow, but you can't just chase cash flow only. Because you need to have that equity, and that's why another part of my investing philosophy is manufacturing equity through whether it's developments, whether it's subdivisions, or renovation. Just being able to add value to your portfolio, so you're not so worried about what's actually happening in the market as well. Because
you can kind of put a little bit of sweat equity in to get that uplift.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you find that easy enough in locations that you're not within touching distance of?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it depends. I mean, it's probably getting a little bit harder these days with construction costs. So, back in the day, it was pretty easy to make a fair bit of money if you had the right sort of duplex project. It's a little bit tougher now because the construction costs are more expensive. So the location, my mindset on the location's changed a bit, because I used to do a lot of those in sort of regional type markets. Now they're all coastal, because coastal is in demand. There's good capital growth there. You build something that's fairly high spec and everything, and the results are still there, but they are more expensive to build, so it doesn't suit everybody. In terms of renovation, I find the people that make the most out of that are people that get in there, do it themselves, because once you start hiring trades, it eats into the profit.
The dollar starts increase.
So I wouldn't be recommending doing any structural stuff generally with your portfolio, unless you really know what you're doing. Otherwise, just some cosmetic work, things like painting, floor covering, window coverings.
And are you saying that as a way for, say, capital appreciation, or to increase the rental income, a little bit of both?
It does both.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's good for capital appreciation, because that means that along with the organic capital growth, you could finance that, refinance the equity to help use as a deposit for your next property.
Yep.
Subject to your borrowing capacity, but it's also good for increasing your rent. Now, if you do have a target of you want to achieve 5.5% yield or 6% yield, but you're not finding that, you might find a property with 4.8% yield. But it's it's dated. You can do some work to it. Maybe you can increase the yield to get it closer to where you need it to be by doing some cosmetics on it
and buy it at that lower price point. So just coming back to another thing that you mentioned there as well, because you're just throwing out absolute golden nuggets left, right, and center. If we come back to the belief of that potentially an asset or assets may need to be liquidated in order to help retire debt out, when constructing these portfolios, are you factoring that in as in that, okay, I might buy you with the intent of selling you in whatever it is after a full market cycle perhaps, or is it?
That's exactly what we do. Yeah. So every time I buy a property, whether it's for myself or for someone, I'm always thinking, okay, this is a property this is where it is in the cycle.
Yep.
So I still believe in the property clock.
Yep.
Some people say they sort of don't, but for me, it is quite important to understand where that cycle is. Like, buying in Perth when it's completely at the top of the market in a volatile market is likely to go down. It's probably not the best place to be. Best time to be buying, but buying in a market that is sort of 8 o'clock in the clock, where you can see that it's a bit of a rising market. Days in the market are falling, buyer activity is increasing. They're the times that you want to get in. So you're hopefully going to get some suitable equity in a fairly short time frame, and then we can look. Okay, we can hold this throughout cycle. So we might say, okay, your cycle here might be going from 7. I usually say sort of could be anywhere between 7 to 13 years, but it depends on your strategy. So it might be, okay, we can hold this one for 5 to 7 years. And then we can use this as an exit strategy. Sell this down because we're going to pay off that. And then on this side, we're going to do build a duplex, and we're going to sell one, and the one we sell, we're going to
pay off the debt with the other one.
Yeah. And then there's different types of finance that we go into as well. So you've got your normal investment loans and things like that. But people might be maxing themselves out with that. Then we can look at getting development finance for a development, which basically means that the lender, there's not many lenders that do it, but some lenders like La Trobe will lend you 75% of the GRV. So the gross realized value of the project. So if you're building a duplex and the feasibility shows there'll be a 25% profit margin, they'll lend you 75% of that, which should cover the entire construction costs.
Yeah.
So you don't have to pay. So it doesn't come against your borrowing capacity. So we look at interest.
Really strategic finance now, right?
Very strategic stuff. So that's why it's really important to work with a broker who actually understands what you're doing long term. There's no point having a broker who just comes back to you and says, "Yep, your borrowing capacity is $1 million, so let's go buy a property."
Go for gold. Yeah.
So they really need to understand what you're trying to do and what the long-term goals are. So everything comes back to strategy.
Do you, just speaking about broking and whatnot, obviously this isn't specific financial advice, but just in your lens and what you would typically do for yourself with respect to, say, for example, going principal and interest or interest only on specific products? Are you hard and fast down one camp, or it's, again, depending on the circumstance?
It depends on the circumstances and depends on what the market's doing. So I used to be hard and fast. Like, I grew my portfolio with interest only.
Yep.
But things have changed over the years. And of course, banks have started to tighten things up because basically, if you have too many loans at interest only, that actually affects your serviceability now, because banks will then actually look at, they'll take their lens and they'll look at, okay, what are your repayments going to be when you come out off 5 years? Although, generally you refinance it and go back
again
to
if
interest
you
only,
could,
but the banks don't see it that way. So if you have too many interest only loans, that actually curves your or cut your borrowing capacity. So having a bit of a balance between interest only and principal and interest. The other thing to also consider is what the rates are. So I do encourage people to look at, because there's going to be different rates, different interest rates, whether you're interest only or whether you're principal and interest, right? But the repayments are going to always be higher for principal and interest because you are paying some
principal down,
but the interest rate might be lower. So sometimes the actual difference in repayments isn't that much. So there's not that much. Maybe it's worth paying some principal down on that. But the other thing to consider is what you're doing with that property. If it's not a property you're going to keep forever, why pay it down?
Yeah.
And the other thing about growing your portfolio is you need to be growing it through the equity. And I go back to my first property, Rockdale. I did grow the equity and we financed it a few times to grow my portfolio, but I never paid that off. But it always had a loan. I think initially started with a loan of about $200,000, and after we financed it, took out equity loans, it probably built up to about a $400,000 loan. But the equity kept increasing the property, so that the property might have been worth $900 million or something by the time I was ready to sell it. But the loan, the loan was there. So so the actual, the equity kept increasing, and that's where the wealth is, because then properties are like you sell and then you walk away with that profit. You don't need to pay off the loan. And that's where some people think, well, I've got the loan now, I need to start paying that down. but you really need to be focusing on how you can grow the equity in the property.
So mentioning that word equity, given a circumstance, and this is just your own personal beliefs, would you, if you had cash deposit and you also had an equity available, would you use your cash or would you use equity to fund that deposit on the next investment?
Again, that's a strategic question, because if you are using equity, some people think equity is just free. But equity does come in the form of an equity loan, which means if you're taking equity out, that's actually going to be more loan against that particular property.
Yep.
So your cash flow overall goes down.
Yep.
So people need to understand that. If your objective is to have 5% yield, or you've got a positive cash flow property that you might have had for a couple of years and has actually got that positive cash flow or something, and then you take out equity because you want to go for another property, you've got to understand that your yield or your cash flow on that property is not going to be the same. So it's really strategic around that. So, in that circumstance, often you might be better off to put your own cash in if you've got cash. Using equity to grow your portfolio, which is what I did initially, is a really good way to build your portfolio. It's an excellent vehicle if you've got no cash.
Yep.
If you've got cash, then, and of course none of this is financial,
which is what you'd do, right?
But absolutely. And I guess for what I did, I grew my portfolio with equity because I didn't have any cash at the time. These days, I actually put cash down.
Nice.
I don't take out. In fact, I probably haven't taken out equity for ages, actually. And I can just use an example. A couple of years ago, one of my purchases was in Brisbane, in a suburb called Manly West, and it's positive cash flow. Now, people say, but you can't buy positive cash flow in capital cities. But I put down 50% deposit on the property. So the property was 1.3 mil. I put down half of that just in cash. And the property's renting for about $1,100 a week anyway. 5-bedroom house there, and it's positive cash flow because I've got
the debt is so low.
The debt's so low.
Yeah.
So and the debt across my whole portfolio sits at about 35% now.
Beautiful.
So that's where people also need to understand that the whole premises between what positive and what negative gearing is comes down to debt levels. It's not just black and white, like, well, you can't buy positive cash flow in a capital city. You can't if you're going to leverage it really high.
No, but if you took no loan against it, of course the thing's going to be positive.
And if you're a cash buyer, and some of our clients are cash buyers, we miss out on property sometimes because there's another cash buyer in the market who pays cash, and we miss out because we've got a loan or something. Yeah. So that's right. If you're a cash buyer, then your property is positive cash flow straight away. So that's another thing, but that's something that you can build up over time. So first time investors aren't going to necessarily have a few $100,000 in cash
deposits every time.
But over time, if you've grown your equity and you've been good with your savings, then you might be in a position to do that.
What are some of the roadblocks that you see people face when they're trying to build their portfolios out? Obviously, you would have seen numerous number of clients, and I'm assuming that there might be some common threads that kind of stop people. And is there a general, like, it's after property number 2 that people are stopped, and what are those roadblocks?
Yeah, look, it depends. Like, a lot of people do. I think finance, can be an issue, especially after property number.
When you say finance, you mean borrowing capacity?
Borrowing capacity. Yep. But one of the things that I see people often do is that they might stick with the same bank. And if you've got 3 loans with that bank, then they're too exposed. So the bank basically sort of says no, but then other lenders will say no as well because they see you're already too exposed with that one bank. Yep. So having that finance and being more strategic about finance in the first place is really important. The other thing that people tend to do is probably be too highly leveraged and rather, like we say before, rather than use some cash they've got, they actually will take equity out of maybe their PPR and then go to buy an investment with that, and then realize that the cash flow is not going to be good enough, and then they can never make a decision on a property because the cash flow is not good enough. But they keep thinking that they can buy a positive cash flow property with 100% equity. So that comes down to an education piece that we've got to sort of
overcome,
educate people on. But I think the other roadblock is people's mentality around where to buy. Sometimes people want to buy near where they live because they feel that they can check on the property, things like that. So again, that's just something that we need to help people with. And often people are more comfortable if they buy their first property near where they live, and sometimes that can make sense. If they live in Melbourne and they want to buy in Melbourne, and the data makes sense to buy there, then that's okay. But growing their portfolio further, if they keep wanting to buy properties in the same area, that's going to prevent them from moving forward as well, because then they might be saying, well, all I can afford is now a unit.
Yes.
And a unit in Melbourne's not going to work out. Yeah. So then I've got to sort of say, well, actually you get a house for the same same price in another area. Yeah. I was just talking to a new client yesterday who wanted to buy in Sydney. and she's got a budget of 1.2 mil, but she was really wanted to buy sort of around the Randwick sort of area, and around there, I mean, 1 bed, 2 bedroom sort of unit. And we were sort of talking about sort of the data and the pros and cons, and I was saying, well, you can buy 1 or 2 bedroom unit around that area, and it's questionable about how good an investment that's going to be. But you could also look at going to the Brisbane market, buy something on the north side, $900. $1 million, you can get a standalone house on a decent size, 500, 600 block of land, and ways to add value as well. But it's that mindset by saying, oh yeah, but Brisbane's so far away, how can I check on it? So it comes back to, I think I should just buy near where I am. But that can be that can maybe stop your portfolio growing the way it should if you buy the wrong property, essentially. Yeah,
like, I mean, even coming back to that, like, what was it? What did they think they were going to go and like clean the gutters out of that apartment in Randwick?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Because there's rules around how many times you can. I mean, a property manager, there's rules around how many times
you can even visit the property.
I mean, they generally will check on a property, 4 times a year. Essentially, they've got to give the tenants their 48 hours notice and everything like that. So you can't just rock up and hey, this is my house. Can I just?
I just want to check that everything's still okay.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of a mindset that people have. I think we're sort of just growing their portfolio. One thing that we used to talk about in terms of trying to build the portfolio more was around different structures to buy in. So often, if you bought in trust and you bought sort of standalone properties that so like neutrally geared properties that covered themselves, then you could sort of buy in trusts so that they that wouldn't really come against your borrowing capacity, and it was a great way to be able to extend your portfolio a bit more. However, there's the banks cracking down on that now. So people need to now look a bit more carefully and a bit more about be careful about the advice.
The mechanics behind it,
Macquarie was the first bank that came forward and said they're stopping trust lending, and now CBA's come forward and said that they're only going to lend to trust for their own customers. And as soon as Macquarie came out and said that, I basically said I think probably all the lenders are eventually going to follow.
It'll be a snowball.
Or everyone who's giving the advice around buying in trusts and different structures, we probably need to sort of reevaluate that. And I think that also comes down to buying properties it's not about how many properties you have. So it's not about getting out there and buying 10, 20, 50, 100 properties. It's about buying quality of properties. And if your borrowing capacity allows you to buy 3 or 4 good properties, then just make sure you're buying good assets. And then look for other ways to obviously to increase your borrowing capacity, whether that's increasing your income. The rent on the properties might go up. The interest rates hopefully will sort of come down a bit more. That can all affect things, stuff like that as well.
Do you see that there's like a particular number of assets that people would need in their portfolio to get to a passive income target of, I don't know, whatever, 100,000 or 150,000? Like, is there a number of assets? Is it closer to 5? Is it closer to 15?
Generally 5 to 6 is probably the number. But if you sort of break that down, I mean, let's say you got properties that are bringing in $30,000 a year in rent annually. So let's say you had 5 of those. That's going to be $150,000 in rent. Now, if you're talking about passive income, you need to sort of minus your property manager expenses, minus your rates, minus tax, anything like that.
Those running costs.
So minus all the running costs. That should bring you down close to sort of around that 100,000 income with having those 5 properties paying $30,000 a year. But the trick for that is they need to be unencumbered.
Debt.
There needs to be no debt.
So
the magic number would be 5 on that for that level of
but debt free.
So it comes down to your strategy around probably over time being able to acquire more assets than that, preferably double that. If you can get 10 properties over the time and then sell half of them to pay off the other half.
A couple of sacrificial properties.
But also looking at other strategies, and this is something that's worked well for me, is around doing developments. And if finances don't permit for that, maybe going in with a JV partner to do something like that, or like I said before, maybe looking at development finance to do things like that, because that can actually help you build your portfolio as well. Because I paid off the debt on our house through my investments and some of my duplexes and things like that. But it's important to be debt free to get that, but you need to work out the strategy on how you can do that, realizing that the average person's borrowing capacity these days isn't going to just allow you just to buy 10 properties or buy 12 properties, as much as we might hear all these things on social media about how people can buy 20, 30, 50
unlocked
properties. And as a strategist that everyone's got a borrowing capacity, and we need to work with that and see how we can get there. But having said that, things have changed over the years, but it's still very doable. When I bought my first property, I thought I'd missed the boat. So I was paying $250,000 for an apartment, And it was just after the Olympics, and the market had boomed. And I thought, oh, what am I doing? I should have bought before.
Yeah,
it's too late. Like everyone was saying, oh, you should have bought before the Olympics because properties were only 150,000 before the Olympics.
Yeah.
And I thought, so the same conversation that people are having these days was having back then. And the same conversation back in the early 90s under Keating and Hawke when interest rates were 18%.
And do you think it'll be the same conversation in 10 years' time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's always going to be the same conversation.
Yeah.
There's always going to be, not enough housing. It's going to be too expensive to get into property. I think the conversation is probably going to get more so because there's a lot of talk around how, kids these days are never going to be able to afford to buy a property. So, you need to be able to set your family up and how are you going to help your kids get into property and stuff, because that's going to be an ever-going issue because the market's not just going to come back all of a sudden.
Are you still like a fundamental believer that like property is the way to wealth creation in Australia?
I believe so.
Yeah.
But of course, so I'm not a financial advisor. I don't really do shares and stocks. I mean, I've dabbled a bit in other things. I've dabbled a bit in oil and all sorts of things. But property is really the thing that's done really well. It's been very kind to me.
Yep.
And I'm definitely a believer that it does do well. It's definitely less volatile. Although you can get your money out of the stock market quicker, it's with properties less volatile because it takes longer to purchase. Yep. It takes longer to sell.
You're not getting that daily valuation in red or green saying your property is worth this.
If something happens with the US government or something, it's not, you don't suddenly have this valuation that all the stock market's just completely collapsed. Yeah. The property market doesn't collapse just like that. Yeah. So it's just a little bit more tangible. Yep. But I think people need to realize it's also a longer term process. So it's not like
get rich quick.
Yeah. Well, some people do, they want to, quit work straight away. And, they might have read my book and say, oh yeah, I'd like to just buy a couple of properties and quit my job or something. But what I want people to realize is that, I've done that over time. Yes. That is built up over time. But if you have a goal and you work towards that, it's achievable, but it's important to enjoy the journey. And, for me, it's not about retirement. It's about sort of lifestyle choices. So it's, because, while people might think they don't like their job and they just want to, sit on the beach or have a continuous holiday, you get pretty bored with holidays.
What happens? 6 months into that journey.
So I think it's just having that choice that if you're not that happy, then if you've got enough passive income coming in, from property, then you can make a choice to work less, to find another job, take a bit of time off. And COVID was a excellent example where, a lot of people lost their jobs and, they were stressing about money. But if they had, a second source of income, that would have really helped.
Provided them a bit of relief.
And like for me, we were fortunate that the COVID times was some of the best times for our business. Everyone was wanted to buy property and stuff. But at the time, I didn't know what was going to happen as soon as COVID happened. But for me, I realized that if the business didn't go so well, I've actually got rent coming in I've got a passive income coming in anyway. So that gave me the comfort to do that. And I realized at the time that I was lucky that I'd set myself up that way
beforehand.
So that so I'm not just relying on one form of income. And I think that's the message that I can give to everybody. It's just to, you need to have more than one source of income.
Like, just if we to come back and go, if someone's starting out, would you say don't expect this in 5 years? Hopefully you get there in less than 4. Do you have like a bit of a timeline, you said kind of get rich slow? Is there like a rough?
Yeah, so I guess the disclaimer on that is it does come down to your borrowing capacity and because someone who's, I think the average Australian wage is around about $70,000-$80,000. So if people are earning around that or less than that or slightly above that, that's going to take a lot longer than someone who's earning $250,000, $300,000. So that's the first thing. But generally, like I grew I got to about 100,000 in passive income after about 10 to 12 years.
Yeah, wow.
And when I started, I was only on about 50,000 as a teacher. Now things are probably slightly
a little bit different,
more difficult in some ways now, but that gives an idea of what's possible. So I do think something like that's still possible, particularly with a lot of people if they do earn higher incomes. If you've got a combined income with $180,000-$200,000 in a household, then that sort of thing's still quite doable. But I think when people come and they want to sort of achieve $300,000 passive income, and they say I want this in 5 years, we need to have a bit of an honest conversation there. So that's not really going to happen. No, unless you've got
$5 million in cash.
Yes, that's right. So in which case you probably don't need to buy
exactly.
You've already got the cash.
Yeah, really, really cool. And that's part of why I wanted to get you on the podcast and understand the philosophy. Obviously, like we said, you've been doing this for a couple of decades now, and obviously helping clients for more than a decade as well. And you kind of gave the listeners a bit of a nugget there. But do you have like any little bit of advice that you can give, say someone just starting to build out the portfolio, maybe they've already got 1 or 2 assets, to either encourage them to continue on that journey, or just some lessons learned in the past, maybe aside from the mining town piece, for the listeners to take away from this podcast?
Yeah, I think it's really important that people do research and they understand the investment they're making, and like they really need to have a goal and have a strategy in place. So like really knowing where you want to get to is important, because like if you just go to buy a property, like why are you going to buy the property? So like when I first started, I just bought it. I just bought it. And even my next property, I just thought, it's a funny story. The next property I bought, which was because the next property I bought was also one to live in. So I did that sort of thing, I rented out my first property and then moved into another property. Next property I bought was close to my best mate at the time. And it was out in an area out near Campbelltown, out of Ingleburn, where it was just cheap. And I thought, I can afford to buy there. So
I'll take that.
Take that. Now I was lucky that ended up having the lowest vacancy rates in the country at one stage, and it had really good growth. But at the time, I knew nothing about that, so I had no strategy. I didn't know anything at the time. So people need to understand why. What their goals are, because you need to, you're buying property for a reason. Like for me, and I always say to people, the only properties that I actually love is the house that we live in and our holiday house down South Coast.
And that's it.
Everything else, it's a vehicle. It's a vehicle to create wealth, or to create your lifestyle goals or whatever it is. So don't, and that comes back to another thing. Don't get so emotional about your properties you're buying. Like, the fact that someone's painted the walls purple or the daughter's bedrooms pink. Like you can paint that if you don't like it, but that doesn't change the structural integrity of the property or the numbers of the property or the asset, or the fact that it's in the school catchment zone of the best school in the area and it's in a really nice street. People need to look past some of these things, take the emotion out of it and just look at the numbers and how that's going to help you. Now, never fall in love with a property, never fall in love with a suburb, because it's just the data. And when people come to work with me and my company these days, we give them a wish list to fill out, which is basically just to understand exactly what they're looking for, your current situation, what properties they currently own, and what they're trying to achieve, so we can really then start to piece together a bit of a strategy, piece together a plan for them.
Yeah, that's really, really wonderful. And I suppose like that's the bit of wisdom that I've absolutely loved to pick apart from this particular podcast here. You've gone through it. It's a learn from the mistakes that I've made in the past. You've bought some properties that you wouldn't necessarily buy again. You've had the whole mining town piece as well, and you're still holding that property in the portfolio. The whole apartment versus don't buy apartments conversation as well, and that's the really beautiful thing there. And I suppose the wisdom that we're instilling on the listeners here is that be really kind of selective with the assets that we purchase, because as we're starting to experience now, borrowing capacity isn't infinite. And if we only had X amount of dollars to invest, you want to make sure that you made the right choices.
Yeah, absolutely. That's probably one of the most important things for people to take away from our conversation today is borrowing capacity is not infinite now. It's not probably like it was before. So really be careful of those assets and just get a good one. And it doesn't matter if you only got $600,000 to spend, you can get a good asset for that, but just make sure it's a good one. Don't try to buy $200,000-$300,000 assets. Just get a decent asset and let it sit there for a while. And then when you're able to buy another one, but just understand where you're going to. Don't try to buy it, because sometimes I do have people sort of say, I want to buy 4 $250,000 properties and want them to be 10% yield, but it's not going to work in my opinion. So that's really important to just have that strategy. Have some goals and just enjoy journey, but really get educated. Do plenty of reading and listen to plenty of podcasts and read plenty of books.
Like this great one and like your great book.
Well, this great podcast definitely. I've got a podcast called Positively Geared. People can listen to. There's a lot of other people out there with really good podcasts, which I'd recommend people listen to. And read books. So I've got Positively Geared and Buy Now. My books, and I'm actually writing another one next year.
Ooh, any teasers you can give us?
Well, that's one that is going to, the premise around that is about how to set your kids up for the future. So
I will be getting a copy of that. Thank you very much.
It comes down to a bit of that conversation we were having before about how difficult it's getting for kids to.
Yeah, beautiful.
And a lot of it comes down to how, because I always had the goal to set my kids up, before I had kids. Basically, I set myself up even before I met my wife. So, but that was always the goal. I knew that one day, and I was a bit of a late starter with getting married and stuff, but I knew one day I'd have a family. Well, I was hoping one day I'd have a family, and I wanted to set myself up before that. And now I'm sort of using examples of what I've done and what I recommend people try and do.
Beautiful.
And it's not about having the big house on the water or all those sort of things. It's just about doing something within your means, but just setting kids up and realizing that they may struggle to get into the market in the future because of the costs. And for me, And so coming back to apartments, I own a couple of other apartments, by the way.
Yep.
But they're bought for strategic reasons.
Yep.
I've got an apartment in Alexandria, which is doing exceptionally well. They keep putting their rent up all the time, which is really good. So Alexandria, quite near the city.
Yep.
If my kids decide to go to Sydney Uni, we've got somewhere for them to live. I've also got an apartment in Newstead in Brisbane. If they decide to go to University of Queensland or somewhere up there, we've got somewhere
for them to go.
So a bit of an asset there for them. So just a few strategic things like that people can look at over time.
Something that I'm really, really, really passionate about with a couple of very young kids of my own. It's something that I'm starting to get into the headspace of. So that will be the third Lloyd Edge book on the bookshelf of mine. So I'm really, really looking forward to it. Mate, I really want to thank you so much for this. I've been wanting to sit down and have this conversation since I first picked up that book, Positively Geared. Absolutely loving the podcast as well. I hope we can get you back on for another pod. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate
thanks, Joey. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, mate.
Cheers.